How's my audio, first of all?
Oh, it's great.
It sounds good.
Sounds
Mine's
like
good.
it sounds like you, Charles. Yours is a little bit too good.
Okay, sorry.
And so the nice thing about getting the fiber uh, into play here is that it's nearly 1 gigabit upload.
Oh, very
So
nice.
what I'm gonna do for my own purposes is have consecutive streams, like not consecutive, but simultaneous streams to YouTube and the other ones, right?
Oh, very cool. Yeah.
So I think the only one that has kind of that doesn't have that as like doesn't allow that is Facebook. But then again, their streams are quite crap
Yeah.
in terms of I think they don't go anything higher than 720. So if you're gonna show code and things like that, it's kind of meh.
Yeah.
You have to
Yeah.
really zoom
It's
in.
not really a professional platform. I don't think anyway.
Yeah. So whatever.
Yeah.
But I've been doing the meetup now quite aggressively twice a week
Cool.
for 2 to 4 hours really each time. We're building an event sourced and event modeled time tracking application for contractors and employees.
Very cool.
So it's kind of something that's usable, can be open source, but then also useful for actually using it for yourself. So I'm getting my son to do some work, and maybe he'll use the time tracking thing to mark off what is done and all that kind of stuff, and then I can pay him. But the other thing is that it also will have the by the slice fixed price billing as well included. So fixed cost projects are really not very finely sort of granular. Like they're not. I guess they're kind of like giant buckets of like I want this project and I'm just going to pay you 25K for it, and then it's just all sorts of grief at the end. So this by the slice is really about being able to deliver each state transition and each state view as its own billable piece that's
Mm-hmm.
uniformly priced, and you measure the progress like that. So the time tracking, it's not just going to track time; it's going to track those fixed bid pieces
Mm-hmm.
as well, but on this finely grained sort of cadence, which is going to require a lot more, I guess, different types of input fields where traditional fixed cost isn't usually accommodated like that.
Yeah. So
If
that
that makes sense.
I think it does. There's a lot of stuff I'd like to sort of unravel a bit. There's I think as you have experience with different domains and different things, you start to get insight into how things work, into some of the things you like, the things you might not like, the benefits, disadvantages, both personally and potentially universally as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and, uh, and so some of the things that we're talking about here is, you've said, so I want to come back at a little bit later, and we'll dive more into like what event sourced and event modeled means, and how we can get up and running with that, and more about your meetup as well, and um, about those things. But then you said this by the slice, and so you're talking about this project that you're working on, where you're keeping track of time, and so there's this idea of like billing per hour, per minute, per second. There's this idea of billing for a chunk of work, and we have these words, right, like chunk, or like a product, a finished product, or a slice.
Yep.
And so this. It sounds to me like we're using the term slice to signify a smaller piece than the full product, and a smaller piece than a chunk, but a slice. And so we're kind of trying to break up the work into smaller and smaller pieces, and we can say, this is a slice. It can be a thing in and of itself. It's a deliverable, you might say as well in another
Mm-hmm.
context. But what exactly does that mean, slice, and why is that significant?
Yes, slice is kind of a vertical slice. If you've looked at any kind of a three-layered architecture diagram, you kind of have your UI usually elaborated at the top and your database all the way at the bottom. So a
Mm-hmm.
slice definitely goes top to bottom. It's kind of like if you read about TDD and any of that, it's a
Mm-hmm.
tracer bullet, out of Scrum. Maybe you've read about tracer bullet, making sure you got a spike of exercising the entire infrastructure with every piece that you deliver.
Mm-hmm.
But this goes a step further because the architecture that you're talking about is not just elaborated on the static model of what is. It's elaborating BDD, by example, behavior-driven development style architecture, which means what is left on disk after each step as you progress through time, by example,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time, what are people seeing on their screens, again, by example, over time in a particular use of the system. So there you can exercise at all the little corners that you want to explore, such as retry for invalid login, too many rooms all booked at the hotel, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of elaborate that over a long story, which people can follow. So the slice really is about the types of state transitions and the types of state views. Those seem to be really good anchors for something that can not rely on people to give bad estimates as we've done in Agile.
So
And
you
just
said
look at
state
those things.
transitions and state views.
Yep.
So there's also a lot here. There's a lot of words you've used. We might call them buzzwords, but I don't think you're using them as such. I think you're using them.
I don't think they're buzzwords because I don't see them on any resumes.
Yeah.
Technical jargon.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I know you guys are technical, so that's why I'm talking to you this way. But when I'm talking with a business person, I don't use those words.
So what I meant by that was I don't see this as being buzzwords, although in some conversations they might be. But what I see, the way that I see you using them as is sort of reference points into deeper dives that we could have as well into talking about where these terms are coming from. So
Or you want to come back to the jargon piece because that's quite important. That's
absolutely.
I mean, that's we can right off the top talk about that. I'm actually declaring war on jargon to the point that I called the Addison Wesley books by Martin Fowler as the jargon builder series, and you should all dump them into the garbage can because all you're doing is building up silos of tech and non-tech people continually.
Yeah.
And all of this crap that we're dealing with here is really just yet another business application with really trivial state transitions, quote unquote, and it's the same bloody thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Yet we're all, infatuated with about 100 different patterns that we as technicians need to know to get this job done, and we get buried in certain subsets that may be good for one stack versus another.
Yeah.
That gets rid of our ability to do polyglot development with others that have other skills in other languages.
Yeah.
It's really, really unhealthy. So if you've seen a lot of animosity from me on Twitter and other places, it's because I'm sick and tired of people just not seeing the real problem and using Agile as a band-aid and other things, not really getting to the point that what we should be doing is finding common ground to talk with people in business and tech together using the same terminology, which most likely is English language or whatever your language is, and common sense. That's really enough. There are some technical problems that are usually an OC complexity. You do it once and you reuse it throughout your architecture, such as, how we're going to do retry mechanisms, or how is this pub sub going to work? Well, guess what? Once you get that done, all the other slices of features of how you transition to state can reuse that. It's an investment. So that kind of work is time and materials. The actual state transitions of how far you got in your hotel booking is really trivial and should be just yet another copy paste of, if you're doing event sourcing, it would be your command handler, and for your projection would be your event handler that you would copy the previous one that worked and change all the data in it and continue on. So there's a real nice cadence to copy paste, but the infrastructure, no. Lots of stuff. So yeah, jargon, evil, bad, don't use it. Don't talk about crazy things like stories and user story mapping, and it's like, what is all this crap that you have to memorize to talk about a very simple system? We've used pen and paper with forms in triplicate with yellow, canary copy, pink copy, whatever. That used to go to different departments to do the next thing, and no one needed to make any special terminology for that. You have to remember one term, form. Hey, this is a form where you fill stuff in.
But
guess what? It goes to the next thing.
But we still need to have an understanding of what a form is, and we need to have
but it's
common
a very
understanding
small.
in
It's a
that case.
very small set of word. A set of a vocabulary is very small. Even if someone doesn't have it, it takes you a second to do that. So
Okay, but
event modeling and all these things drive at saying, how can I reduce all this to be the smallest number of concepts, patterns, and words, so that I'm not studying a domain-driven design book for a whole month, and then the rest of the company also tries to do that and never actually happens, maybe 2% of the people really get it, and then you have to spend an entire year doing brown bag lunches, and
Right.
then where are you in that year? So the more you require people to know, the less likely you're going to have a common ground with everyone to talk about your business and actually fix things.
Yeah, and I guess like you've caught on exactly to what I meant by buzzword and what Charles said as jargon, and it seems like you didn't like my use of it, but we've definitely used some
Yeah, I take
when
great
we
offense.
when we use
Great
the
offense, Drew.
well, I mean when we use the term BDD, even something we said like three-layered architectural diagram, slice as
Yeah,
vertical slice. So there is this understanding that when I say this word, what I actually mean is this, which can expand upon to this and this.
yeah.
And
I'm
so I just wanted to
talking
dive in a little
again.
bit into what that means.
Yeah, no, that's good.
That's,
And you
yeah,
should do that because I'm going to just talk to you like I know you. And then
which we
you
did.
interrupt me. It's like, oh, by the way, for our listeners that don't know who these clowns are that we're interviewing, he's going to have to explain what he means by these audacious statements he's making.
Yeah, well, I can also maybe give you a little bit of an idea of our intent with the live stream and then our channel as well, and how we're sort of building upon this. So right now we have a live stream, and we're starting to invite people to come and watch while we stream. Wednesdays 2 to 4, and they can ask their questions and whatever. And
So it's like a radio show.
yeah, and we're having
Cool.
like more of a discussion and conversation style at a
Hey,
level
can I
where
tweet that out so that people can join and can they
Yeah.
like tweet questions at you?
yeah, absolutely. And
Did you tweet this, Charles?
Yeah, I
a
did.
little bit. We
Yeah.
haven't really
You were
A little
tagged.
bit.
yeah we
You
You were,
tweeted it a
you were
little bit.
tagged.
You either did or you didn't.
just a
I
little.
tweeted it a little bit.
Sort of.
Just a little, might have been noticed by somebody. I don't know.
And so we sort of assume that the average listener will be a software person, somebody who has like a relatively decent knowledge on this. But at the same time, for somebody who might not or wants to dive deeper, then we have the follow up. We'll have YouTube. We have maybe some tutorials that build into that, into the topics and into the subjects, and then also some follow up code repos on GitHub. So one of the things I'd like to come back to. Like when it comes to event modeling, I'm really excited to have you particularly here to talk about it. And when it comes to event sourcing,
Uh-oh.
oh, well,
Feedback.
somebody liked that. So I'd like to kind of get to a point where we have something like a Hello World equivalent for event sourcing or event modeling or whatever,
Yeah.
and that's just basically a Hello World in my mind is you're able to set up an environment where you're able to do input and output and actually start using a tool, right?
Yeah. I mean, I like those sample projects, but there's always the argument, oh, that's a trivial thing, you can't use it for production. And then
Yeah.
you give them a production thing, and it's like, oh, that's too heavy. You
don't
need
know how to
all this
get
crap to
started.
actually get started. I don't understand. It's too complicated.
Yeah.
So event sourcing and all that got thrown under the bus unfairly like that.
Yeah.
And that's why I like to start with what is the next thing. And event modeling gives you that cadence that TDD tried to do
Yeah.
of being able to follow the information very easily and not rely on some artificial sort of construct of red, green, green factor
Right.
as the first things you have to do, but actually follow the information and make sure you're implementing the path for the information to get to happy path as fast as possible, and harden that
Right.
as your core architecture. So it's moving the information architecture as being the core architecture, which is a lot more powerful than the technical stuff that we got distracted by.
And that's kind of what I wanted to jump to because I think that the project that you are describing that you're working on during your biweekly, and by biweekly I mean twice a week meetup that's now
Is it
online.
semi-weekly or bi-weekly?
I think it's
I
biweekly
always
would
get
mean every.
confused between those two.
Well, biweekly means both.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's ambiguous. It could be once every 2 weeks or twice a week.
So you always have to explain it. That's the beauty
Yeah.
of it.
Find out when.
Yeah.
Maybe 1 week you'll go and there's not a single meetup.
That's right. That's right. So,
Twice a week,
but I
okay?
think that the project that you're working on, it really exemplifies the idea behind why you're working on this project, which is to solve these problems, right? And it's
It's something usable. I mean, that could make a hotel system that I'm not about to run a hotel system,
right.
which I use as an example, but because people want something to relate to. But
But-
this is something that I actually want to use, and it exercises some of those, how we're supposed to develop. So part of it is actually I don't want to use
how
it. I
we're
want
supposed to develop.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I can ignore really core things that people think are important, such as having authentication and all that. And you know, I don't have to have authentication because I'm running it on my own machine with the same web
Yeah.
interface that the other thing will be deployed in. And all I do is use something like Nextcloud to sync the folder with the project manager, and they have a folder called Adam's Hours,
hmm Not
and
Adam's apple.
guess what Adam's Hours contains? Events
Yeah.
that the same kind of code can run and interpret and run whatever you want off of it. So
Very cool.
it's a perfect abstraction of exactly how we treat information, how we treat it, how we treat information, and how we used to treat information before digitization. And we got a lot of obviously I keep talking about the history of digitalization.
Yeah.
As soon as we got really fast processors and integrated circuits and transistor and all that, it really did kind of set things on their head because you could really do a lot more processing. But certainly the storage and everything else in and around that small piece did not follow the same quantum leap of productivity. So
Right.
there's this imbalance that we had to work around, and it's left a lot of pain in what we consider digitalization.
Yeah, that actually you've kind of implied that a lot that we can unpack as well. We still haven't really given vertical slice and slice, I think, enough of a sort of explanation as to what that means. And I think my understanding would be that and we actually did kind of talk about it, but like you might say,
No,
for
I didn't
example,
do. You're right. I didn't do a.
we have
I didn't
like
do a proper.
a full vertical slice would be something that works up and down the stack. So that would be, maybe representing your UI layer, representing at the application level, going through the business logic and interacting with a data store. Oh, there we go.
So why don't I
Looks
just
nice.
show you instead of keep talking about it?
Sounds good.
Here's that project that I was talking about. You can see vertical slices highlighted in yellow. I don't want you to really read stuff, but you just get the concept.
It's
You
okay.
can
We
zoom
can.
in if you want.
Yeah.
So
So the event
so
model basically says, here are the screens that you'll see across time as you do maybe time entry, where the information comes in, where it comes out, all that kind of stuff. Show some relationships that are important in the data if you want. But the key is that I can basically do this. Maybe I can take care of these two vertical slices, and this little Mario here basically means I'm going to do that in .NET on Linux. Right, that's my code for what I'm developing in, and someone else has got a little where is it? Little elephant because they're working in PHP here, right? And their initials are at the top. So we can divide up the work, and I get paid for each of these slices, each of these green boxes and blue boxes. I get paid for it, right?
so Adam, just for the listeners, what makes because most people are probably used to using a single language for entire system, and it's really really tough to make like a system made up of multiple languages work together. What allows people to integrate that? Like, what allows you to use .NET on one side and PHP on another side?
Yeah, so this is one of those things that we actively force because it actually makes a better architecture. It doesn't allow one language's preferences to skew the information architecture one way or another. So what we have here is, the traditional kind of diagram, UML-ish diagram that'll show you how we do that. You have your browser that hits, some Nginx thing, and then some of these slices, like you saw up here, are done in .NET, some are in PHP, and the slices correlate to a command handler or event handler. So, if I'm working over here on time tracking, you can see Mario is here, and that's Linux on .NET Linux, right? Linux.NET, whatever. But tracking add time and modify time is handled by that on port 3001. You can do Docker Compose to stick all this stuff together. Underneath the event store, it's a file system in this case, but you can use the proper event store from Greg Young if you want, and I suggest you do. But that's how you glue the state across all of these things. So once I move on to the next piece after I added the time and want to actually look at, maybe approvals of, if someone's timesheet is approved or whatever, that might be PHP. So that'll get routed by Nginx to do that. And well, how does that actual stack of PHP code know what I did in the other stack? Well, it's right here. It's the same file system that's shared by both. So those events are in there as well. And just to finish this thought, the other thing that we share across all of these things is security and session tokens, so that if you're logged in, you have the same tokens traveling with you. And then if you want to share something, maybe like reports and maybe some of the HTML, so you don't have to redo it because that's kind of tedious. We can have a common place for that too.
So then they communicate with files on the system, basically, right?
Pretty much. Like it's
Yeah.
event sourcing is about putting, something on disk when you know that that's actually what happened and it's a fact, and everything else is derived off of that. So it's kind of
Yeah.
like it's kind of like using the inner workings of your database
Yeah.
as your actual domain.
So to give a similarity for the people that are maybe used to non-event source systems using relational databases,
Yeah,
if you, for example, were using Postgres as your database, and maybe you had part of the backend written in PHP, part of the backend written in Go, part of the backend written in Ruby, part of the backend written in .NET, they could all communicate with the
database.
Postgres database and be able
Yes.
to interact with each other and
Well, yeah,
even
absolutely.
yeah, so it's basically something like that. Like maybe the PHP thing updates, the user's address, but then the parting Go sees that, it can act on that, right? So something like
Yeah,
that, right? Yeah.
exactly. But there is one article that's kind of good to talk about, because you mentioned that, yeah, no, most people don't know about event sourcing, any of this kind of stuff. This is totally applicable to traditional systems. And Fred Brooks kind of got it way before any of the other people got it, which was basically, if you show me state, your tables, I'll understand what your system does. You can talk about your fancy algorithms and how you program, and I'll continue to be mystified. It's a very famous quote from the Mythical Man Month, to
Yeah.
which actual Mel Conway also contributed.
So
And,
I thought it's actually very interesting that you bring him up because I was thinking that the project that you're working on to show what event sourcing is and event modeling is
I don't have to.
well, no, but the project that you are working on to do
Yeah.
that is somewhat analogous to what event sourcing and event modeling are doing anyway, which is, in my opinion, maybe, and maybe I'm wrong, but which is also very similar, I think, to what Fred Brooks is kind of looking at or addressing in his book, and that is that a big problem that we're trying to solve here is how do we work together to accomplish a goal when we have more than one person really working on
Exactly.
it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I just wanted to, say that, hey, this is all event, this event, that, whatever. Most of the people, like, going back to how I kind of write about it at the beginning, if we look at this pie graph, event sourced approaches are just like a tiny sliver of what people are doing. Everyone else is just throwing crap against the wall with Ruby on Rails and getting things to MVP as fast as possible, right? So we're not going to win any battles by just trying to evangelize DDD or whatever other
Right.
stuff that we think is great.
Well, it's
It's an echo
interesting.
chamber.
It's interesting you'd use Ruby on Rails because if I think of Ruby on Rails, then one thing, if I would say like the hello world of Ruby on Rails would be a blog, right? Build a blog in 10 minutes or
It
whatever
doesn't
with
matter what
Ruby
you're
on Rails.
building, as long as it's an information system. I'm happy to compare and contrast the
Sure,
approaches.
I'm just saying like that's the typical like I think how Rails was introduced was like, here, look, you can build a blog in 10 minutes and here's how blah blah blah. And so that was sort of like the hello world basically intro to Ruby, or
Yeah,
not Ruby but to Rails. What
yeah.
about when it comes to like event sourcing? Is there a sort of like a
Well,
very
that's the
typical,
thing.
here's
That's
a
what I was going to
project
get
that
to.
everybody starts with and here's the hello world
That's
of
the
it?
thing. There are. I think some people. Well, yeah, like if you want to learn agile, you kind of do the bowling ball example or some other crap like that, right? No, there is not anything that's kind of quote unquote event sourced. That's bespoke to be talking about event sourcing. Kind of the event sourcing thing that gets asked about all the time is like, well, how do I know there's no other other person that already took my email and registered, because this eventual consistency is the first thing that they ask about.
Right.
It's a really simple problem to demonstrate and how to solve it with event modeling. But regardless, the idea is we got to talk to this giant circle here of everyone else. And event modeling is that bridge, because really, when you're talking about event sourcing and domain driven design and all that, it's really an island of in itself. You're asking people to make a leap of faith, to believe a few case studies here and there about how it went better or whatever. But you're really asking people to subscribe to a brand new way of doing things.
Right.
So event modeling basically says, look, one thing that is true is that we have events, even if they're just in our head. I registered for the hotel, I booked my vacation, I paid for this. These are things that we know from the true representation of UX that have happened, and our minds do work in events, whether the implementation is events or not. And so when we look at the traditional system from the eyes through this, the optics of tracking events, we can basically elaborate how we would move that through time. When we have a user interface this is for a registration piece, we have an event that says, hey, I registered. I put in some password, I put in my email, blah, blah, blah. Even though this event didn't get stored, it ended up getting stored into some table, right? So here's a table with an ID, name, email, and a password hash. And then, when we want to show some information back on the screen, we had this thing pop up on, here's your email, and, on to the next step in your workflow. So it's using tables, but the analogy, so notice that things are happening as events, such as, especially stateful events, things that change the state of the system. It's quite important differentiation. Looking at state is not making new events. So
I think actually
let me just finish the example here, and then we can talk about it.
Okay.
So notice the similarities. We do have these events. So user registered, and then we have verification email sent. Those are things that we know that have happened. Those are things that we do. But if we look at a traditional system, there is no real event object that we use or anything like that. We might have some logging in there to be able to parse that out if we actually needed to, but then you don't know if it's really one-to-one with what happened. Can't really rely on it. It's really after the fact, cart behind the horse kind of thing. So what happens to these orange things? We actually throw them in the garbage, right? We can see that we overwrite data. Unless we put a history table in there, we really don't know unless we go to backups or whatever. It's not that good. So as we continue to struggle through our traditional route, we notice that we actually hit quite a few problems with our CRUD. Well, this was easy in Rails. We have referential integrity that creeps up on us incredibly quickly, even though we think we're dealing with just buckets of data with no behavior. Even without behavior, we're still hitting some core concerns of overwriting data and referential integrity biting us in the ass really, really quickly. So people kind of say, you don't need event sourcing. It's actually harder to do event sourcing because they always compare it to some in-production system with a pub sub and a message bus and whatever, right? But the quickest thing that I can do in event sourcing is really just write down the goddamn event and move on. There is no extra stuff. And I have a little, what's it called? The Trello board example that I keep using, which is just a shell script and written in Fish shell that you don't even need to have in a file. It's literally a multiple line one-liner that kind of gives you a little folder in your home folder called .trello, and in there it just builds up a history of events, and it shows you a little Trello board, and I can erase that, copy that. It just keeps working wherever it is. The events are the source of truth, and that's the nice thing, is that information there is really the thing that continues to live on. Whether you're using Ruby or some other language changes, you might rewrite some of these things, but the thing that doesn't change is information. So information architecture is the most important thing. But anyway, it's really important to look at it through the lens of traditional stuff. Understand that we do not keep events, but they are there at play anyway. And we can choose to ignore them, don't do event sourcing, fine. But maybe at least with an event model, we can help the people that are running into referential integrity problems have a blueprint or something to go to show on a timeline with just regular English and common sense that this is why the system's not working, right? And get out of those situations.
So you've definitely mentioned state and looking at state as a source of truth versus having events as a source of truth. And the thing that keeps coming to mind for me would be, if I go to my bank and I say, oh, look at this, I don't know if people still have bank books. Do people still have bank books? Is that a thing? Update your bank book. You update your bank book, and you look at it, and for some reason it says $1 million, but and I know that I don't have $1 million. I go to my bank and I say, hey, I've got $1 million. This looks kind of weird. Let's see how I got here.
I'm gonna stop sharing so we can talk.
Sure. How did I get here? And that's what we're going to care about more than like the state of my bank book being, showing $1 million. We're going to look at what were the transactions, what were the deposits, what were the withdrawals, where did they come from? Let's look at those events, I guess, or those transactions, and let's see, as opposed to
so here's the thing. I found here's another revelation after 12 years of event sourcing. You know what's better for finding bugs and doing that? It's not the unit test that points out your bug. It's having a breadcrumb trail of how you got to a situation that's actually written on disk somewhere that you can audit. All the TDD stuff that I've been doing, the test first, all the unit tests, the promise was that if you do it right, and man, that is a tough ask of people with, teams with juniors, etc., to have a suite of tests that are going to pinpoint where an error occurred or there was a problem. the thing that's actually made it a reality to fix something within a 4-hour window in production, and actually have your customer service reps tell you where to go to fix the problem is only possible if you have a proper accounting system into your information. And that's one of the things that's overlooked. So there's many
accounting
promises
system into your information.
Yeah, they have you have a proper cause and effect that's traced back through exactly what events happened on a timeline. You have full traceability as to how you got into a bad state, and so bugs become not a thing that you got some code that's doing that. You actually are working off of the fact that the wrong thing got persisted and someone's seeing the wrong thing, or a wrong calculation is done, and for certain how you got there. Not about trying to wave a chicken at midnight over your head by doing some stupid restore from 3 weeks ago to maybe get a glimpse as to what that table might have contained to get to that. Right?
But hands down, waving the chicken at midnight does work sometimes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'll take my odds with the other way any day.
Hey, just so you guys know, on my side, I don't see any of you. I don't know if you guys can see me.
I can see you.
I can see you as well.
Okay, I'm not sure. Zoom's spinning. I hear both you guys, but I can't see you. But also, my computer is the one that's streaming. So.
Oh, right. That's kind of interesting.
Maybe you just have captured the output somewhere. So just look at it on your look at the stream on your phone and see if you can see it. Just look at it on your
okay.
Look at the stream on your phone and see if you can see it.
Let's find out.
I should do the same thing too. Can I see?
Yeah, it's black.
Can I see? Oh, great.
Yeah, it's black. Yeah. They can hear us though, but they can't see us right now. So we'll see. One thing I could do is I could try leaving and coming back. Like that might help.
Try. I think it might be something to do with maybe some anti-competitive things that they're doing to one another.
Yeah.
Zoom, Twitch, and all that, right? So.
I'll be right back.
Could be. Okay.
If I can.
Yeah. Good luck.
It's having trouble ending.
The nice thing is though that I think this is recording, right? So
right,
we should be able to.
Looks like your Zoom meeting's not responding, Charles.
Well, that sucks.
Yeah, it kind of does. So yeah, okay. This is pretty interesting though. I think you've been doing your meetup now. You said every couple of times a week, and doing it online, so anybody can join. Are you recording it and putting that up anywhere?
Yeah, I am. But the only problem with the recording is that I had a horrible upload speed.
Oh right.
Oh look, there's another Charles that joined.
Nice. So you had a horrible upload
so maybe
speed.
he can
so
join
that
from his phone, so he can see us on this phone, but then he can stream.
So you're
Twitch.
uploading concurrently, like while you're recording, or are you recording and then uploading after? Because I've noticed about a 3-hour recording takes about 2 hours to upload to YouTube for me.
Well, that's the thing. Now that I have this fiber, it's not going to take that long. It's
nice.
nearly 1 gigabyte up. So
very good.
That's like 80 plus megabytes a second. It's not going to take that long.
That's fast.
So let's see if we got the video. We should have tested that. Eh? Oh yeah, there it is. Cool.
Yeah, it looks a lot nicer now.
It was basically I don't know what happened. Like this, I have an old mining machine that I'm using for this, and it was pretty beefy. It has like a beefy graphics card. And there's really nothing else running on this but OBS and this. So I'm not sure really what's happening. But anyways. Technical difficulties.
Yeah. So no, just to get back to how the format is, that right now we've just been using Zoom and recording in the cloud because of my old Shaw connection was kind of bad, especially the upload was really bad, and I wanted to wait until this was installed and done, which happened just this Monday, and I'll basically just kind of like dividing things up so that there's at least a show or something to see every day on YouTube, so you can join live and participate and ask questions and be part of the discussion, but then we want to make sure that there's a channel, there already exists an Adaptec channel, which I'm going to use for this, and that's just going to have those as a series that just comes out maybe 7 days a week.
Oh, very cool.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think we'll put some links down in the description.
Yeah.
To that as well, and I'll make sure to check that out. So something I kind of wanted to come back to, we talked a little bit about.
Do you want me to show some of the stuff again? Because some people that or we'll just. I guess it doesn't matter. People
Well,
will see it on the recording.
if you show that, the same thing might happen.
Oh yeah.
What? No. Okay, we got to test that. I'm going to share screen.
All right, let's just give it a
Let's
try.
just do this because this is.
Yeah, let's give it a try.
You know. Okay, let's see the Twitch stream react.
Looks good to me. Looks good.
Yeah,
to me.
yeah. Cool. Yeah. So I wanted to get to the next point, which is a
Small design up front,
which is the promise.
SDUF. That for some reason that sounds kind of funny to me.
Stuff.
Yeah.
So I think you could call
Maybe
it,
that's why.
ST, FU.
There you go.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
But,
Well. Okay. So this is actually, it brings up a lot of interesting things, and I hear people. I mean, people are going to complain no matter what, and some people are proponents of frameworks, you might say, and some people aren't. And there's all sorts of different ways, and it seems to me like almost no matter what you do, you can't get away of like buzzwords or technical jargon or whatever. You can't get away from people eventually, for multiple people to work together in an organized fashion, we have to agree upon some common ground, some type of common ground, whatever that is.
But that's like, I agree with you that we need to have some common language, but I think what we have is an artificial push towards more jargon. Humans like to make things complex, and that's to make themselves sound important, that's to silo their stuff. For example, if you do...
Well, for example, I hear DDD almost every time I hear event sourcing.
Yeah, it's irrelevant. In fact, we've moved away from having DDD concepts such as aggregates entirely. There's an unnatural affinity. There's a show that we had on this subject, actually, which shows kind of, if you look at your traditional approach to an aggregate in DDD, right? Am I sharing the screen? No, I'm not.
No, not right now.
I'll share now. Share. Okay, so your aggregate is like this whole thing about, let's say there's an order and it's got items list and then it's an address and a delivery method that's associated. So the idea behind an aggregate in DDD is to have this tree, this graph of concepts and classes and actual objects when you're running, to only have this aggregate root, kind of a gateway checkpoint to make sure you got transactions and all that.
So when you say root, you're saying actual
root.
Okay.
Aggregate root and an aggregate. Aggregate is the whole thing, just like over here on the screen. Aggregate's this thing here, the whole thing, the whole graph. You pick one, usually at the top of the tree, which is your aggregate root, which is the only way this thing can interact with the outside world, or at least get state changes from it. But this is really heavily noun, verb, OOP kind of paradigm of saying dog dot tail wag or whatever, or wag tail, right? It's that kind of like the real world is account dot withdrawal and account dot credit. No, the real world really is about make a transaction. These are some of the concepts that kind of get muddied, and DDD unfortunately ended up being a thing that was built up more on top of making UML more usable and OO concepts more usable, unfortunately, because it was back in 03 and all that. But if we did, if we have like three things like add item, complete, and deliver to as kind of the methods that we want on this, you notice that they actually, even without event sourcing or any of this kind of stuff or stream-based stuff, we can actually take a look that we have, these three things actually are a composite of subsets of this graph, right? In order to do a deliver to method here, I don't need to have the state, hydrated for the items. They're irrelevant. You don't need to do that. This is functional versus OO. Like, this is why you want functional. But you can do functional without a functional language if you concentrate on the information system. So we kind of looked at, why is it essential, useful, suboptimal, or harmful from business and technical side, and we compared, where these aggregates fit on this maturity model. Realistically, if you look at an event-sourced way of doing this, and this doesn't mean implementation, this actually could just be the way you're thinking of it. So if you look at everything that happened in the system, you can look at a function as just the fold over that and whatever you want to do to it. So just change the delivery method. I could just take all of these and have the function filter out the things that I care about for something specific. The command might have the ID, blah, blah, blah. But realistically, there are some efficiencies here, such as, hey, just give me the old events, but subset it for this particular entity. So it could be this substream of this big stream. But then, hey, you can go even further. It's like, I actually don't want just the events for that one order entity. I actually want just the, even a finer search for just the things that deal with the address, for if we're talking about delivery. So now you get a real sort of filtering out as to what the state of the order is based on this. And this functional model is a lot more healthy, because if you take DDD, as you're going back to your original argument, if you go back to DDD, this is what it teaches. And it means, I don't care how trivial your stupid little thing is, you must do this through the aggregate route, and you must hydrate the whole thing using all of the different state that's used there. And maybe if it's just, non-event sourced and you're using an ORM, you'll get your little, eager fetch with your ORM, and it'll populate all the things here, and very simple statement, right? At that point, you may as well just use an object database, right? But whatever. That's the kind of stuff that we talk about, and we want to make sure that people understand what they're getting themselves into when they're talking about DDD and making things easier on them. It's just a step in a better understanding of their information and how their system changes. And when you go back, it's really just pen and paper systems that are tracking what you do. When you go to the doctor's office, when they didn't have computers, they filled out forms, they put it in a filing cabinet, and they worked off of your records of all your visits, right? So that's kind of the idea there. Anyway, yeah. So DDD, we don't do DDD anymore, at least not in any shape or that's recognizable. Sometimes we do, because it helps if people understand what this is and it starts them. So some of our implementations do have a traditional aggregate in there, but it's getting to be less and less so.
I see an interesting note there. Use
What's
the
that?
word scaffolding instead of crutch.
Yeah, we're trying to be more positive, because I'm such a I like to piss in people's cornflakes.
Well-
and so there's people that do business better than me. So
Well, I've noticed a few things, and I think one is when it comes to the idea of, like, working with people or organizations, people respond differently to different things. And if I come out and I say, like, you're doing it wrong, my initial response, if I hear someone saying that to me, is to be defensive, because it comes across as an attack, as opposed to if somebody comes out and says, like, look at this awesome way of doing things.
Yep.
Whoa, I'm gonna look at that with an open mind. Actually, not really. I'm already biased that it's an awesome way.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Simpsons episode. I always like to bring in Simpsons episode quotes. Oh, I think we lost the feed. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I think we're fine.
Zoom's crapping out.
It's just
Yeah,
you.
you're probably having what I had before.
Yep.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not streaming anything.
No.
No, but I've got it. It's working on my end. But you are
Now it's
recording.
working. Now I see you. Okay,
great.
So anyway, now I use the Simpsons quotes in all our meetups, and so one of the interesting things that we have is this idea of where Lisa uses Bart as a science experiment in comparison to a hamster who's smarter. And one of the things that Principal Skinner says at the end of the episode is, well, even the best scientists are part P.T. Barnum to be able to sell their ideas. So, maybe after we edit this video, we can insert a clip of that hamster flying in the airplane. Anyway.
So I guess I'm not super familiar with P.T. Barnum. I'm trying to guess that that's somebody who's good at selling books or selling things, selling their ideas.
It was like I think, wasn't it like a circus guy that kind of step right up and that kind of thing?
I don't know. Oh, maybe.
Isn't that step right up and try this snake oil I'm selling or whatever?
Makes
right?
sense. But I think that that's interesting in the sense of scientist. But I was just thinking, if you have an idea, but you're not selling it, who's going to pick it up? Like, just because you have an idea that's good doesn't mean that people are going to know about it. There's got to be some way for it to proliferate.
Yeah, I mean, you can just put the work out there and trust that people are going to listen to it. I mean, this is why the blog kind of stands on its own on the event modeling site, and people that are I've found people that have started doing event modeling themselves, and they didn't have to talk to me or anything like that.
Oh, very cool. So
They
so
started their own group, and so that's a good thing.
so that's something. Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about that, like how to get started with event modeling. But before we do that, why don't we talk a little bit about you and about how you came upon or came up with or discovered event modeling. So I think you and I, Adam, we've known each other for quite a few years now, and you've always been talking about event sourcing. You were talking about CQRS, and actually you're the one who sort of introduced me to these concepts. But event modeling, this is something that came out of your experience with these, right?
Yeah. So let's see if I can share the screen again. Yeah, event modeling kind of goes back to um, just realizing how much how important it is to talk about uh, events and notice some core key pieces of all information systems, and that includes the fact that we have input output, which is really better phrased as affecting the state of a system, and output is better phrased as being informed by what the state of the system is and how you interpret those things that have happened within it. Um,
Oh, that's a
so
can of worms to open up. So input
yeah, and
is better
so here,
phrased.
so the realization was after 12 years with well, event modeling kind of got coined by because it needed to, because we thought, oh, that could be kind of under the umbrella of related things such as event storming and other things,
Hmm.
but it certainly wasn't. Those things are just really high level feel good things for people to do brainstorming around, but it doesn't give you anything concrete to actually move to implementation with.
Hmm.
So that was the thing that was bugging me after all that as well, especially after going to Italy and doing the event storming summit with all the people in and around DDD and all that. And it's actually quite a toxic community these days, unfortunately. And anytime that anything's questioned by someone else other than the few chosen,
Yeah.
that's whatever. I'd rather leave that behind. So I really don't. I try not to talk about those things and let this stand on its own. So the idea is that all information systems are event sourced. Like I said before, events happen even though that you do not have, you don't store something in an event as an event in a
Hey,
system.
Adam,
They still
could
happen.
you
Yeah.
could you give some examples of events just to make it clear for
Yeah,
the listeners?
yeah. So an event would be something like a hotel booked, and that event would have the information about which hotel room you had, what the date is of the booking, and how long your stay is going to be, and perhaps how many people are going to be in that room, and any other pertinent information. Or they can be a separate event if they define those things later. So it's really
Okay.
about digitizing an information system
Yeah.
that you could do with pen and paper.
Yeah.
You can talk about it that way. So
So it might
those are
be
events.
How
at
would you do it
restaurants.
in pen and paper?
Well, how did hotels work before computers? The same way.
So it might be someone comes up there, they fill out a form with all the information. It might be like a hotel book, or it could be you're at a restaurant. The waitress or waiter comes over to your table. You give them an order, so order placed, right? And it
Yeah,
might say,
Greg Young
okay,
uses
well,
that example of
yeah,
the cafe.
I use
Yeah,
a cheeseburger. I get a cheeseburger and fries with a root beer. Someone else gets, the steak with a glass of milk or something like that.
yeah.
And it could be like also like maybe you're ordering something from a store. It's like, hey, I moved. Let me change my address. So address updated, right? And like it's
Yeah.
always past tense, like it kind of sounds, right?
Yeah, it's what's on the ledger, right? It's there's a lot of other things like CRDTs in and around, like how you scale things like YouTube comments
Yeah.
and Google Docs that kind of come from that same line of thinking. So it's nothing really unique to event sourcing and
No.
CQRS. This is really fundamentally what makes information systems go. And I
Yeah. I'm,
think
I'm just I'm just trying to like make it more clear for people who aren't familiar with this. So it's something that already happened that you're
that's right.
recording, right?
Yeah,
It's address changed, order placed,
that's right.
room booked, right?
Yeah,
And then
because you're
when
going
you
to
do
be,
that,
yeah, and it's important to have them in the past tense because you're going to be using those events to run the system, right? You're going to be
right?
projecting new reports, projecting new screens from things that have happened. Some of
Right.
them might have happened a long time ago.
So
So
so for
past tense, yes, absolutely.
okay, so for example, you might say if it was a hotel, like Joe Blow comes in, they say, okay, room booked, and it's booked from whatever the date is today, maybe 2 days out. So like, from the Tuesday to the Thursday. And then someone else books a room, but it's not for this week, it's for next week, from like the Monday through the Friday, right? And then if you want to figure out, okay, well, let's say at the end of the month, the 27th, or let's say the 27th of this month, which rooms are free and which ones are available. So what you'd have to do is you'd look through all these events and you'd say, okay, which ones apply to today? And like, for example, like a lot of them you can ignore, and you were kind of talking about that, like we might ignore a bunch of them. So, if the time period doesn't apply to the 20, I think I said the 27th of this month, we ignore those. But if we have one where the time span applies to the 27th, we would collect that. And then we would then look, okay, well, which of the rooms in the hotel, have someone in it, which one don't? And we can make a projection from that. Like basically, like you might think of like a report that says, or like a screen and app that says, these are the rooms that are available, these are the rooms that are booked.
Yeah, you really start to re-examine what you would do in a traditional system with an index and a query, right? Because you really get to live and feel that, and you're a lot closer to the actual inner workings of the business to be able to express those concerns in something that's quite close to, what the business is doing.
This kind of takes you a level below what traditionally people work out with the
that's right. It's a more responsible level, right? And so when I teach this, I say, well, what's the most responsible thing to do right now? The most responsible thing to do when you press this button, if all the criteria are satisfied, is to store the event. Don't worry about transforming it to something that, doing other lookups so the event looks prettier or has more relevant information in it. No, what is the shortest thing between your mouth and your thoughts to what it is on disk? Do not take any extra steps. Do not pass go. Just write that down that right? And so events are supposed to be tiny. They're supposed to be the third normal form, unique things, normalized information. Your projections of those events are really that's where you have your first normal form where you have repeated information everywhere.
Okay, so a projection for someone who's more used to a relational database, that's kind of like a query, right? Like if I was to
like a view, a view would be perfect because
you're right.
It stays there.
A view is more accurate.
Yeah, a view is more accurate because you can combine a whole bunch of tables together in some joins, and then you have this nice table in your view.
Right, but you would express that in terms of like select, maybe joins, where's, having stuff like that. So it's
conceptually it's the same thing at work in your mind. Yeah,
and you could because you think people come to this hotel and they book a bunch of rooms. Like this could go back like decades, right? So you could, for example, run through this, right? And just look through every event starting at the beginning of time. But you might say, okay, well, sometimes it's acceptable. Sometimes we can do that. It's performant, but sometimes that might take too long, right? And we might have strategies which we can optimize this, right? Like we could build our own, something like an index, right? Now you would have to do the program yourself, right? Yeah. But I think that's pretty cool. Like to see that low level details. And a lot of it's not that hard. There's like a handful of techniques you can use, depending on what you're doing. And you get to see that, and you get to make that conscious decision of how should I optimize this, right? And it gives you that absolute kind of control, right? And for me, for example, I don't drive so much anymore because I live downtown, but when I drove, I always had a manual transmission car, right? Rather than automatic. And, it's a bit more work, but I have power, right? I have control. I can really make that machine move. And sometimes when you're programming, right, you want that power and control. And doing this type of stuff with events can give you that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't want to kind of bore this with these details here because there's a lot more to, if anyone wants more information on it, just go to eventmodeling.org and read this article. It ended up making Hacker News top story back last September, which was nice. And then just see all the different views into the system. Then the 7 steps to actually do it in your company if you want to do it. And then isolate.
7 steps?
Yeah.
Is there a book coming out, The 7 Steps of Event Modeling?
Yeah, I'm not going to call it that, but yeah,
why not? I like it.
The book has gotten larger because of the traditional systems. Because event modeling is good for non-event sourced. So anyway, if you read this, there's a 7 steps, right? You're brainstorming of all the different events that could happen in your system. This is Greenfield, right? You can at the bottom, it's got your existing system, how you would use event modeling to talk about a sidecar on a legacy or to decompose something. I think the second article about the traditional systems, that's a really good example of how you would start to basically wrangle legacy code without just relying on unit tests.
Yeah.
Because what you can do is skip the logic, and basically, if we look at the article, so if we skip the logic of the legacy code, we only look at the inputs. Where is it here? Oh, this one here. We basically concentrate on just what it is that we did on the screen and what it is that we have in the database, and we can start to ignore the extra stuff that happened in the database and really understand why extra side effects are at work. And that's really important for your legacy system, because it might look like you did a registration, user registered in some old CRM that's open source and there's a kludge of everything. So if you look at the screen that you registered, you put in some information, maybe 3 or 4 fields, but then you look at at the database level all the updates and inserts that it did. You're thinking, oh, what is this thing about like setting a default value for login retries and all this other garbage it's doing, right? So it allows you to make better sense of the system and how it's working without getting distracted by all the crazy if statements and getting into the sort of never-ending bottomless pit of trying to figure out all the permutations of all the if statements you've had to swim through as you debug that. So kind of stop at these insert reads and updates or whatever, right? I should just have these selects. I keep forgetting to change that. But anyway, you can look at that as saying the only thing I can rely on with any system is what the user sees and then what's on disk when I turn the power off. And so that's kind of the two things that you can hold as anchor points to make sense of stuff. That's the heart of event modeling. And we don't do that with the UML and all those other things. What we've done is we always got like, well, what's your class diagram, and what's your sequence diagram, and what's your activity diagram, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, where are your interfaces?
Like, really, how much is that going to give you, right? It's just going to, you can't even assert that it's correct. And if you can, it might be with some tooling that's esoteric. It's not reachable by everyone. It's a horrible, horrible proposition. So if you just look at, hey, what's on disk across time? Hey, what are people seeing across time? I can make sense of that. And I can put in the stopgaps. I can put in the sidecars. I can put in the compensating actions to make heads and tails of it. But I do not want to be going down that endless pit to try and find out if that damn if statement got ran or not. Right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think from the point of view of looking at a system where you have a lot of moving parts and different pieces that need to agree upon information being having happened, I suppose, events having happened, as opposed to or I guess ultimately agreeing upon the state of things at some point, then it makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to think sort of how you might apply that, or if you would apply that to maybe not so much a system, but just like a much simpler application, like maybe maybe a blogging platform. Not even a platform, just a blog, a single user's blog. Would you?
Yeah. Well, you have things that pop up on the screens and you have things that are on disk, right?
Right.
So now just as a specification, do what humans do best, and that's copy what they see in front of them. Run through an example. An event model of in its simplest form is literally cracking open this thing. Which could be Miro or draw.io or whatever you want to do.
There it is.
And start drawing. What is the screen that you see, right? And then, what's the next screen that I see after that? Right, I can see a series of screens that happen one after the other, and then
So Adam, this might be something like, like you're a person who writes the blog. Okay, like what do you do, right? Like you go to a screen, you start doing some stuff, and then maybe you go to another screen. Is that the type of thing you're thinking of, or?
Yeah, well, by example, it's literally like pretend there's someone with a camcorder behind you as you're using the system. If it already existed, what is it going to be recorded in that camcorder? Right. Likewise, if I have these events, I don't like that yellow; is a little too deep.
What's a camcorder?
So as things are happening, you know, as things are
Sorry.
happening, there's events that are getting stored, right,
Mhm.
on the system, and literally these two things are the core of it. If I
So
have a good
Adam,
example of this blog platform, I can hand it off to someone and say, make this happen. It's a lot easier than handing them a whole bunch of, you know, reams of paper with specifications. If there's some nuance that I want, like, hey, if your blog post is too long, it'll give you this error and tell you a suggestion of how to shorten it.
Mhm.
Adam,
Fine,
do
insert
these
it in here. Take this, right? And if that's what it's supposed to do, go ahead, show me this where I actually made something that didn't, you know, do things properly, and insert it in here, and show me by example as to what error I get, and then I can go do that again here and do it correctly.
Adam,
It's all by example.
so do these represent events or like wireframe screens or both?
These would be wireframes, and if
Okay.
someone's already made like mock-ups for your style, you can reuse those. It doesn't really matter, but as long as they tell a story with accurate by example,
Right.
you know, information, then you have it. It
Okay.
really
And
is about how humans learn. They monkey
yep.
see, monkey do. They learn by
Okay.
doing this, by seeing the real example data flow across, and you can talk about it. It's like, oh, cool. For this thing to happen over time, I can see how I would implement that. Oh yeah, cool. It's actually happening. You know, this is the information that's getting captured at the bottom. If I make that happen, if it's using tables or event sourcing, I don't care. At the end of the project, if it's doing this, I have succeeded. It's my proper done is done. And the nice thing is I can slice it up into bite-sized chunks.
And just for the people who aren't familiar with it, a wireframe, like when you're designing, like say an application that's maybe a mobile app, excuse me, or a website, you're going to eventually get these, like, you know, like say it's in mobile apps, these beautiful screens drawn by an artist. But before you do that, you might create something very rough. Like it could just be a pencil sketch where it's like, okay,
Exactly.
you know, like here's a screen. There's going to be a button somewhere, and this button submits,
right.
and there's some maybe first name, last name.
Yep.
I'm going to, you're probably give that to an artist to turn into something beautiful. The
Yep.
artist is probably going to not lay it out the same way you do. They're going to, you know, use
Right.
their own judgment and stuff like that, make it beautiful. But
right.
it communicates the information there. Sometimes
correct.
all of it, sometimes maybe not all of it. Maybe you just kind of like, you know, you do squiggles. Like I know I need to get the user's information. I'm not going to specify what, but maybe like you figure out eventually it's their home address, their phone numbers, their emails, even though you didn't write that down in the wireframe, right? Like something like that, right?
Well, we try to have all information. This is kind of the sticking point, is because one of the true benefits of having an event model, and this was a real benefit to a really large project, this rescued a system that's in charge of 5% of the world's trading traffic, right? This ability to be able to do what you touched upon, and that's to be information complete. That means I can draw a thread through all the information and show where it entered the system, where it got stored in the system, and where it was used by an external again to view, or to be sent off to an external system.
So I/O,
right?
right?
Systems thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not I/O.
Yeah.
It's talking about systems thinking. It's taking a rectangle of what represents what you control and moving it through time and seeing if it'll trace the same thing for the paths of the data. And so that is something you can do regardless of the tech.
So would you then say that if, you know, someone's developing software and they start to develop wireframes, they shouldn't start the development work doing this, like the actual, like what we have here, until they get to the point where they fully specified all information?
Well, it depends, right? So sometimes for the big system where, you know, you're talking about automating trades on the New York Stock Exchange and CBOE and other really large things, then yeah, absolutely. Those 2 days that you lock people in, it doesn't take long to do this, right? That's the thing. That even though the system was huge, the core of the information completeness was done within 2 working days, right? In a boardroom with all the key stakeholders, all the product owners, all the developers, and all that kind of stuff. Well, not all of them, but representatives, at least seniors, so that you could have each role represented. This is what we will be happy with when it's done. And I can account for every single field in here because it's that damn important. We're not about to reset this project for the 6th time, right? We need to know that if we move forward with this, we're all aiming at the same end goal, and we will all be measured by that exact goal. And that's what's missing with a lot of these agile things, is that we do not have that small design up front. We always throw design under the bus by implying that it's UML, it's big design up front, it's going to take a year to do, blah, blah, blah. We do this kind of stuff in 2 days.
So what's the difference between big design up front and small design up front? Or
Small
what are
design
some of the
upfront is
differences?
something like this. There's no small design up front. What took place of small design up front is emergent design in TDD and test first. And they thought it was going to be good enough. But It really isn't, because it's a willful ignorance where you're trying in good faith not to have future features distract you, but in fact you've added rework,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've added rework to your. This is something I talk about here, because if I do this kind of, it's shown here, right? You don't even see it, but it creeps in.
Mm-hmm.
When we do this registration piece here, right? There is no code for your verification.
Right.
That table is this way. However, once we get through to this next feature about verification, notice what's snuck in. There's a code field here. Well, guess what? When we're working on this feature now, we got to crack open the old one to make sure that the SQL statements actually take into account that there might be an issue with this code field.
Right.
So we're blatantly throwing OCP out the window, which is one of the core solid principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember what all those things are, but I'm not going to bother diverting the conversation into Lishkov substitution, etc. Open close principle is one of those core things, and I don't want to use open close principle. Why? Because common sense tells us, hey man, don't rebuild the walls because now you decided your house is going to have a second floor. You have to destroy those walls and make supporting walls instead, right? But that's how we do things in agile and software systems. It's horrible. So this small design up front at least reserves you the spots, and at least can give you an accountability of where you're erasing data and things like that, so that you take away this thing of needing to redo feature A when you're doing feature D because it's sharing the same table and might address that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just gets worse and worse the larger the system gets.
So what happens if you go through that 2 days of deciding everything, and then you start working on stuff, and oh yeah, we forgot to talk about this, and this.
Well, that's your most responsible point, to readjust that and hold it up against the old idea and see which parts that you already wrote and have to change and which ones are fine because they haven't been written yet.
So do you get everybody back together?
No, you don't have to. It depends on how many people are involved and which parts are affected. There's pragmatism to this because it's what we would do with pen and paper.
Mm-hmm.
If we had an organization just working off of regular business workflows on pen and paper. So what we want to do is this, right? We want not just that, but we want even faster curve. Like we actually want features to get cheaper as we go further on in that. And so this is the only time that I've seen in my whole career, system development being move away from this death march that every
Mm-hmm.
good project ends up becoming, even though you have really good agile principles and all this kind of stuff. This amount of rework really does make your initial even high level estimates really go out the window.
Yeah.
And the thing is that if you look at this, if I did feature G at the beginning and feature A at the end,
Mm-hmm.
we'd still have the same graph, which is ridiculous because now what you have is absolutely, this is why you have the no estimates movement, because people say, well, it doesn't really matter. It's just, if someone says that this is going to get bumped to the next sprint, well, the estimate's off.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what kind of crap is that?
Mm-hmm.
How can I actually measure how people are effective? And this is why a lot of people are doing the responsible thing. They're doing shadow ops at night to refactor the code and all that. They still get thrown under the bus and get fired because they're not as effective.
Right.
And it's all just a political game at that point, because who's going to blame the other person more for incurring large costs to each feature?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? The most responsible people, the people that are trying to keep the test suite running, those are the people who are going to get fired.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you see all of this kind of stuff, and it's like it's sort of organizational behavior or whatever it is, and maybe you have non-technical management, and you're kind of appealing to certain people, and all of like the signaling, and it ends up becoming like just a lot of theatrics, I suppose. So I guess there's a few questions that I have, which is and you've actually just come to it, the rewrite. I mean, people come in, and it comes back also, I think, to sort of the initial point about buzzwords or jargon and agreeing upon things and whatever. We have this sort of, some people are going to say, oh, I like developing this way. I like following these patterns. I like these design principles. I like these whatever. I like these technologies. And so they'll come in and they'll see things are different, and they'll want to adjust them to what they like. And so that might end up in a rewrite. Or another person might come in and say, oh, I like these other things. Or, if somebody's come in first and they've designed a system, or they've built things and they've put things in place, then you come in after. You're either conforming to the way that they've done things, or oftentimes, or you're competing with them for changing things to be more suitable to your
it's a power
preference.
struggle.
Right.
Absolutely, it's a power struggle.
So I don't know if like event modeling helps in any way with that, but it seems to me like it does sort of aim to bring people together, at least to find some common ground somewhere. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. And so you do that by, again, as we started out, getting rid of the jargon and the things that we can use with plain English. Is that, hey, this is what the user sees over time,
Mm-hmm.
and hey, this is what's being stored in the system over time. If you're using tables, fine. This is what you're doing. Here's what you're throwing away, because in the mind, this is the event that happened, and it was just in the person's mind. And perhaps, one day they'll wake up and say, "Oh, if we only stored those events, is there? I wonder if there's a way to make a system where this is the source of truth, because we're throwing away really valuable information here, and these tables kind of suck in the end." So, that's the kind of stuff you allow people to event modeling allows them to come to those conclusions themselves. And this is why writing event modeling with the focus being on traditional systems is very, very important, because that allows people to solve those problems get to the same conclusions using their own common sense.
So one of the things that event sourcing gives you, that unless you do something special with a relational database design, is that it retains history, right? Like, for example, like if I have something where I store someone's address and they move and they change their address, with most people's databases, like the old address is gone, right? Like, what if you needed that information, right? And there's lots and lots of history that you keep, not just addresses, like all sorts of things, right? Like, for example, like who's in this room at any given time, for example, like in a hotel. That's one thing that's powerful about it, right?
Yeah, the idea that you don't know what your business will need next year, and you just realize you threw away a whole bunch of stuff, and it's like, oh man, if a competitor has a system that does retain that information, they can, maybe more effectively contact those people because they actually stored their old emails, and whatever it may be. Just throwing out information is irresponsible.
Right. And then there's techniques by which people use, for relational databases to structure, right? Like, some people might know this as like first normal form, second normal form, third normal form, fourth, fifth, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people who've done this for a while do this kind of intuitively without thinking about it.
That's right.
But that's the process you go through by which to kind of like architect the information. Now, there's a process you also go through to kind of like structure how you might do these events, and that's kind of like what you were getting into with like the process by which you bring up the wireframes and kind of map out what events gets recorded. Like, that's the process which you go through to figure out like how to structure that information. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I mean, what you're doing is the least that you're doing is saying that we will be conscious of this information, and if you're doing event sourcing, you're at least agreeing that you're not going to lose data. If you're not doing event sourcing, you're at least agreeing to come up with a map of where the data that shows where the data gets lost and why. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm trying to I'm thinking from the point of view, like, let's say there's the software developer that's really interested in trying this out, right? Like how do they get into this, right? Like, that it's kind of daunting. Like, where do I start? And like where you start and like where you should start. And like, I think some people don't do it this way, but they should. Like, you don't start with coding first, right? You start with talking to people. And that's like, I think like a lot of the people, the way they think, you make a product is like, you're in the shower, you get inspiration, you get idea, and then you spend 2 years building, you're rich. But like in practice, like, you could get lucky, but in practice, like, it's most likely to fail. Like, you need to go start talking to people. You need to figure out like, what do they want? What's the problems? What do they need, right? And with what you're doing, it's like, yes, you need to do that, but like, we need to organize that information somehow, right? So when you're talking to them, like, you might start off very loose, very qualitative, but eventually you need to get the points like, okay, well, I see you have this problem, and okay, let's think of a way to solve this. And maybe it's in the form of app. Maybe it's not. Like, not everything has to be solved with like computer technology, but maybe it's in the form of the app. If it's in the form of an app or like a website or something like that, it's going to have screens, right?
That's right.
So let's try to figure this out, right? And we might come up with some wireframe screens. And as these screens are kind of going through, like, maybe you're creating an account, you're adding your address, events are generated, right? Like, address added or address updated, or hotel room booked, or like order placed at a restaurant or something like that, right? And these generate events, and then we store these. And like you were saying, like, you can store them in very easy ways. Just put them in a file. Like, maybe you append them all to the same file, or maybe create separate files to whatever you want, or use something like Greg Young's event store database. But you can store it like that, and then you would read from that, and you would create any kind of like view you want on that, right?
Yep.
Like, okay.
So the idea, but you touched on another point, because we talked about information completeness before with that really large company in Boston that was in trouble, and this is what allow them to see information completeness. From the other perspective, we also ran a workshop in Poland where it was a really good idea to actually get a proper startup to be the guinea pig for the workshop.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it exactly said what you talked about. That information completeness about what it is that we're going to have, what screens are going to happen, and what gets stored along the timeline, showed them that they were not information complete. So yes, every idea is not a good idea, and event modeling is a really good way to do a litmus test on your idea to see if you're full of crap or not, and if it's actually has a snowball's chance in hell of working.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So this is actually kind of really interesting, Charles. As you were mentioning that, I want to sort of recap on what was the point that you were bringing up, because I think it was somewhat significant. And was it that, if you're going out to design a system,
Yep.
you shouldn't start by implementing the code for that system, but rather vetting whether the system is well designed or not.
Yeah.
For the
and event modeling is a fast way to do that.
Right.
It's a really fast way to do it.
But this is also that's actually very significant as well. Event modeling is a great way to do that.
It is the thing that'll get you a very good answer of whether you are ready to implement or not. Because if you cannot draw the lines between where the information goes to and be actually accountable for each field and all those things, and have that done with your peers and people that are helping you with your product, or if it's maybe even by yourself, you need that audit of like, is this going to work? Because if I'm assuming that I have some information and I don't, well, guess what? It's not going to work.
Yeah, I was actually kind of thinking, like, today our conversation. I mean, we're talking about these systems. We're talking very much about like systems design and systems development, as opposed to say programming languages.
Well, I always make that distinction. I never talk about programming anymore. I talk about information systems, because it's such a an information system is a better way of thinking about it, since we may have things that we don't program, maybe things that we do manually, but they're equally important to having your organization work. Right? It's not about, hey, we're the most important thing because we're working on the app that's represented by this company.
Right.
That kind of idea is very old school and ineffective. We need to be more holistic, less siloed, with every single role that we have in an organization. And so if you can find ways in order to work effectively with more people and put up as few silos and walls as possible, then you're going to win. You're not going to have excess meetings. You're not going to have all that. You want your developers working 80-90% of the time that they're actually engaged and billing time or in the office or whatever. You don't want them spending 50% of their time in meetings. That's horrible. That means things are not clear. You don't have a clear vision. Not everyone's aiming in the same thing, so you have to always regroup and see what happens. And Agile makes it okay, because all of a sudden we can put a number to the inefficiency, but it hasn't addressed the root cause of like, hey, no one knows where the hell this thing's going. The best we can do is just at least every single day, show which one's more worthy of keeping their job.
That is kind of funny. And coming back, Charles, again to like the idea, because you'd sort of, I think, preface that as like a way to start with this stuff would be to look and vet out the system itself and the system design. And that's sort of an interesting perspective, because that would be, say somebody who has event modeling, event sourcing as part of their toolkit, or as is comfortable with it, has experience with it. A way that they might apply it would be after they've designed a system that's going to use it. Event modeling, maybe we'll talk more with Adam about that and how that would help to vet things. But on the other hand, like somebody who doesn't have exposure to this, a way that they would start would maybe not be to think about how the system's designed or anything like that, but to just go through it a few times until it starts to make sense, possibly. Yeah. And so what would be, and this is what I keep coming back to when I say like the hello world of something is like typing out hello world, and you have this input output, and you get something that you can start to play with. It's not necessarily going to be the best program, right? But it's something that works. Just like with Rails, it's a blog, and that's because that's typically what people show. Look, here's how quickly and how easily you can create a blog with Rails. Now you have something you can play around with. I'm not saying that's the best blog ever possible, but it's like that's an example of here's how you use this MVC framework.
I mean, the thing is, Drew, is that Rails is probably one of the best things to show how effective event modeling is, because Ruby on Rails has gone, thrown under the bus for being the fastest thing to get going at any expense. And so
Well, I
That
mean,
means
it's
a
a
lot
great
of the
tool for what it does.
traditionalists, well, a lot of the traditionalists will say that, hey, this doesn't have a really good scalability model and blah, blah, blah. And they can bitch and whine and complain about how, how irresponsibly quickly you can get going with it.
Right.
So,
And I think that,
however, if
Twitch or Twitter might have something to say about that,
well,
the
they have to
founders of them.
change anyway, right? Eventually, or whatever.
They're
But
still using it.
anyway, it certainly is not the same thing as a
GitHub
blog
too.
anymore.
No. No.
So, yeah, Ruby is a beautiful language, blah blah, but that's not important. The language isn't important.
Mhm.
It's just, are people seeing this on the screens across? Does it scale? Like, I mean, one of the key things that we do with this is, can an event model show you, all the things that are going to be important to your system?
Right.
And it actually does. It just depends where you mark it on the event model. So just like you would have a blueprint for a house, you do have these things. And one last thing I want to show before we continue just discussing things without any more screen shares. I want to feel, people that are listening are probably going to be like missing out on what's shown on the screen. But now let me just share it here. All right. So for example, if my time entry thing has to be within 2 seconds because we have a distributed team and some people are in Europe, I can put that because of the timeline. I can have SLAs here. If I have eventual consistency issues and people press things at the exact same time and one of them wins, or something's not appearing on their screen in time, I can literally show diagonal lines of when something makes it to the screen from being a projection that's updated, and illustrate by example that this is what success looks like from performance and information accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's literally where the information is in the system without getting into the never-ending pit of logic and UML and other things like that. If we just keep our focus on state and what the state view is, screens, and what things are happening on disk.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you don't do it on disk. I mean, there's one case where we had we had to look for bad words and messages, right, for a really large platform, dating platform, and that looks like a command, send message, and then magic happens, and at the other end, it's a filtered, non-spam, non-bad word message that gets sent to the other person, right? One state change. Well, no. Even though that there's variables at play to tokenize the message, compare it against a dictionary of a specific culture with different forms of those words, and maybe even symbol substitution for when someone put a $sign for S to be able to say shit or whatever, right? That's all that stuff had to be there.
Or an eggplant?
Yes, whatever, eggplants. Yeah, exactly. So all that kind of stuff had to be in there, and it's not a single state change. Either the message was received or sent or not. Mm-hmm. It was literally here's 12 steps that have to happen. Just because those steps involved state that was in a variable and didn't actually get written to disk, it still is state that's important to understand the complexity of what you're describing here. But being able to describe it to business that, hey, first of all, we need the tokenization of the message. Here we have to transform these into all the different forms of these words and all that kind of stuff. These are all forms of the information that takes shape, even though it's just an algorithm underneath. It still is mentally what those things are. So a lot of times in those edge cases, it's we bring that up into actually what a variable is, right? I have another example in here of doing that with a templating engine, right? Like it's kind of like a newspaper subscription or a newspaper where an editor talks about the top level of a newspaper, and then the entertainment section has this and has comic strips here, right? And those are all handed off to other people that are handling that content, and they might have very similar jobs. So this actually shows you recursion in a template, right? And how you compare it against the model of the data and how that has to be traversed. But then you go ahead and you put that over time, and people understand that, oh yeah, this is when the handoff happens to have this part of the template interpreted. Mm-hmm. So I don't care if it's Ruby on Rails in the end. I don't care what the technology is, as long as I can say, this is what the system's doing, and I'm meeting these SLAs.
Right.
Am I meeting these SLAs? Is the information shown in this form? Then I don't care.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Drew, you were asking about the hello world for like event sourcing stuff. I think if I was to pick hello worlds, like you gave the bank account example, I think, or maybe it was Adam that gave that. Mm-hmm. That's maybe a good place to start. Yeah. Or maybe after that, do an inventory system for a store, so you can have people making purchases, you can have people bringing in new products, stuff like that.
Well,
might,
I was also kind of thinking like if I were talking to somebody who was just starting out with software in general, and they
yeah,
had an inclination that they'd like to do web development, for example, and
yeah,
then we said, okay, well, what do you want to do with web development? Oh, I want to build you know applications that have some sort of database and a user interface. Fill out forms, whatever, data-driven website type thing. I would think, okay, interesting. So I might talk with them, and we might talk through a system. And we might build out a system together where we would do things like, here's some forms, here's some HTML, here's how you build a form, here's how you
yeah,
communicate from this form in a browser to a server-side language. Here's how you would communicate here. Here's your what I would call I/O, but it's really like the communication between, say, first of all, the user in the browser, and that's like your forms, and through the HTML, and then between the browser and the code, and then between the code and some sort of data. So we might do something like store that, write it to some files, right? And so we might have like these different layers where you have like a data store where you have some files, then you have your code, and then you have your browser UI. And then we might start to look at like how we'd arrange the sort of the forms, the type of forms, what sort of data we might collect, then how we'd handle that. And we might end up building something like an MVC where we have like, these handlers or controllers that handle the incoming requests and serve up the outgoing information to the browser, and then you'd have those controllers would route the traffic or the incoming and outgoing requests, between sort of your application, your business logic, which would then handle the interactions at a lower level between your files or your data stores. And then we'd also probably start to see things like, as we're organizing our files, how do we do this? Are we storing everything as CSVs, or like what sort of data types, and then as that grows, like whether we need to start sort of indexing things and having different lookups and start to build it like that, so that we could see from the ground up, like, oh, here's some of the things that we might hit, and then we might start to look at maybe a Ruby on Rails, like or some sort of MVC. But on the other hand, would we take that same sort of system and say, well, here are the building blocks, here are the problems that we're going to run into, and then here are some of the solutions we can do. Would I build a full event sourcing system, for example, just using those building blocks? Would I need to have something like an event store, or would I build that out myself?
I mean, like I would, like, if I was showing someone how to do this, I'd start very simple. Like I probably want to expose them to some of the complexity, but in a gentle way so they can understand it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like one approach I've taken is I get people to create an e-commerce site.
Right.
But they're just learning, so I tell them what to do, step by step, and I get them to do everything except like the payment processing, because you need to interact with a third-party API, right? And then what I do is I get them to pick a project, and I'll tell them step by step how to do it. Like maybe they pick a to-do list, but then like there's some commonalities, right? Like, hey, you did a login system, right? And like notice like we went through this and like both had login systems, so that's like a commonality. And hey, you had to interact with a database, right? And you had to like have a way of interacting with and stuff like that, and like that's a commonality, right? And you start to like my experience is if you start with the abstractions, it's there's no context to it. They don't understand it. Right. I find it's usually often better to start with some concrete examples, and if they can do it like when they're in practice doing it with their own hands, and they see those examples in their face, like that helps them say, oh, I've done this a couple times or a few times. Here's the abstraction. Notice the pattern, and then the abstraction makes sense, right? Like, hey, login system, that makes sense, or dependency injection, or whatever like your if you want to do MVC, like, because you
exactly.
See the need for it,
and
right?
so that's why, like in the example that I gave of like starting to work toward an MVC framework, we would start to struggle by building out a system on our own. We would start to hit some of the pain points, and then we would actually be able to appreciate, if we were to use an MVC framework, some of the things that it did. But then we'd struggle with other things and some of the decisions that it made for us later.
Yep. There's usually trade-offs, but like do it without MVC and see how painful it is, right?
Yeah,
and it's not to say like MVC is the only way to do it. There's other ways to do it, but like the idea of mixing, like say you're, it's like every noisy person out my window. is the idea of like say you're doing something web based, like having
Yeah.
HTML, CSS code mixed with the code that accesses the database
Mhm.
and like decides what you're going to do. Like that's a like just like a mess, right?
Mhm.
And then you want to edit something and you wanted to change like maybe like something on the front end, and then you end up like deleting a database or something like that. It's like, okay, that's not the greatest experience, right? So
Mhm.
let's separate these. Or maybe you have like someone else in the company that just knows HTML. They can't do your back, like they can't program.
Right.
And then how are they supposed to go there and edit it, right?
Yeah.
It's mixed in with the database, like programming code, right?
So,
Like but if you put in a separate file, like, oh, that's a view, right? Like
yeah.
put in a separate file, that's a view, right?
So do you think that building out something like a content management system for your website from scratch, with ways for multiple people to log in and make changes to the same things and keep tracks of those changes, would be a good use case for an event sourced system?
It could be. It's not the one I would pick because I think that events feel more natural to someone who's maybe not that experienced with this if it's more like an inventory system or a bank account. Because like I think with at the CMS type thing, like people think in terms of documents. It's like, well, why don't you just replace the whole document, right?
Oh yeah.
Like the deltas
Oh
where
yeah.
you like, oh, I did this line, this doesn't feel as natural to them.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, like it can make sense. I mean, you could even do it where you replace the whole document. Like that's your
Right.
evidence.
Yeah, I
And then you
did.
can,
I did some systems development with some lawyers, and they certainly seem to think in terms of documents.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Same with insurance. Insurance ends up being,
Right.
the best you can do is have sections of the document defined, such as, and maybe identify those as pieces that make event modeling. But what
Hmm.
you're talking about is kind of like what we're doing in this event model that I've been showing, and this is the implementation of it, right?
Hmm.
So you kind of, if someone is starting, you kind of walk them through. It's like, hey, this is this is the class startup. This is how we bootstrap something in Kestrel on .NET.
Hmm.
But hey, similar things happen in Node.js. It's very similar to other tech stacks out there.
Yeah.
And then when we run the application, you can see that it's getting your context, and there's a path that we're getting from our request, and then based on that URL, we do different things, right? So
Hmm.
here we can just write all the texts, right? We read all of this from this HTML file and return that, and that's how they see that page. So someone that's starting out can use this very easily.
Hmm.
Now, if we're actually logging some time, oh hey, this is how we get forms from from the UI when someone submits a page, when they hit a form submission, right? And then okay, cool. So they did submit some time. Currently, we don't have any logic here to see if that was correct or not, or we just allow them to enter anything they want. But here's how we serialize a JSON thing, and this is how we write it to a text file. Right now it's a sample event, but we could give it a better name that has a timestamp and other things. That's fine. And then this is what we return, to the UI. We give them the same form, but we populate with a model of all the times that they already, might have entered the day before and today, just for their context, right, to help them out on the
Hmm.
next submission. And then that's it, right? And then if we, unknown path, if they type in a different URL, that's it. And then, oh, well, what's that model? Oh, yeah, this is how we look at all the events, right? We go through directory, enumerate the files that it's in the events, and we can start to optimize that. Remember that function that I was talking about, function of all events, and then you can start to make that a function of a function that starts to filter out what you have, and then a function of a function of a function,
Hmm.
right? You start to nest them to get really, really speedy and not have to slog through everything at one level.
Yeah.
Well, this is where you start, right? We're selecting, all of the files, read all the text from all the files, right? This is enumeration of all the files that are events.
Hmm.
And then we start to say which ones of these are within the last 2 days, right?
Hmm.
That's all we're doing here. And then we're going to aggregate them um, based on, a new today and yesterday model
Hmm.
that we start. And so we start the aggregation of that seed value. And then for each additional event that we actually have parsed out,
Hmm.
we just keep adding to it.
Very cool.
And that's it. And then we fill the template, and this is where we're talking about all those things that I showed in the other thing. This is not necessary for them to understand event sourcing, but this is
Hmm.
how you would make a very, very simple mustache template type, uh, replacement template for data with some
Hmm.
repeating data,
Hmm.
right? So at least you can teach them a couple of things, but that's less than a page of code that essentially gives you event sourcing in CQRS. right, without it being too trivial, so that you can actually see it working at scale. And that's it. And the rest of event sourcing and CKRS is an optimization of this pattern. You have some aggressive caching so that you don't,
So that'd be
get today and yesterday might be a materialized view instead, right?
yeah.
It may not just be a query over all the events, because doesn't scale. But how do we fix that? Okay, well, if we just subscribe to the events as they happen and just update things, that'll get us the same thing. In fact, I can copy the same logic to go into that subscriber. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, that is pretty cool, actually. Yeah, that's quite a good example. So this is quite fascinating. I'd love to spend some time to sort of build out maybe a vertical slice at some point of a system that would use event sourcing and also like the event modeling that goes with that. So I guess if I want to do that, the best way for me to get started would be to attend your virtual meetup.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to have the recordings, but
yeah.
Where is it here? I had it somewhere up here. Yeah, there it is. So it's a Vancouver event-driven meetup, which used to be called the CQRS ES meetup, and it's on the screen now.
Very cool.
So if you look for Vancouver event-driven meetup, you should find it. Although some people have had problems finding it, depending where you are in the world. So you have to kind of get your geographical and geographic location done properly.
Yeah.
And then yeah. So we have these ongoing things, Friday and Tuesday.
Well, if you're watching this on YouTube, then just look down below. We'll have a link to the meetup on the in the description. In the show notes.
But if you searching event modeling pretty much gets you to where you want to be. And if you go back to the site, there is one thing that's resources that I'm working on organizing a bit, because it's become a dumping ground of everything right now, including all the previous recordings.
Yeah.
So if you go to the top of it here and go to resources, there's a Slack group, which has a big button, because that link used to be just a highlighted link word and people didn't know where to click. Then we have a whole bunch of introductory videos on there with some Golang stuff as well, which is kind of nice.
Very cool.
And then some other, including the original broadcast of talking about the mentality that you need to go into this with, and talking about the nature of information systems.
Very cool. Well,
I think it's easier actually for people, if you're new to programming, it's going to be easier to do event sourcing.
Yeah, because you don't have to unlearn the
exactly. In 2008, it took a long time for me to just remove myself from all the things that I learned.
Yeah.
In software, especially enterprise software. And some of those things are highly biased towards a certain way of doing things. So
I kind of think of it as like the Queen's English, where you'd really have to have attended what are called public schools, but like the private schools in the UK, to be able to speak like the upper crust there, and it would have had to be beaten into you. It's very difficult, I think, to copy, but it would also be very difficult to unlearn.
Yeah, so it's incredibly bad, because the other thing that happens is that as you get going in your career, you latch on to that to be your safety line for if you lose your job, how you're going to find another one quickly, because you're just getting going. So while you have the chance and you're starting, learn this, because honestly, the way you write a projection or a read model or whatever is going to have the same mechanics as you would do things in other stacks anyway. So you won't have that opportunity to really get this really good insight that's quite more in line with the way the human mind works.
Yeah.
And so
I think
that's
something
I would be very lucky to have. Right.
If you have time, and if you're interested in joining us on it, then you're absolutely welcome to. But even if not, I think Charles and I will spend some time to do a little bit of a lecture series with a follow-up tutorial on event modeling and event sourcing as one of our paths. We've got one currently on web development, and we've been doing a dive into sort of HTTP.
Yeah, there's a really good course that I took on Purple, I think, that was a master class for Node.js. And the beautiful thing about it was that it was the reason I did this as an experienced person to go and take that course was because it made sure that you're just using a standard library. You didn't
Right.
have any node modules. It says, what can you do with Node.js to
Mm-hmm.
do web development without any libraries?
Yeah.
And that is something that ended up, showing you exactly kind of the code snippet that I showed you here. It's like, no, I don't want to import a whole bunch of NuGet packages for this
Yeah.
.NET application. The standard library of any of these languages that we're using today are so powerful that you should be able to use that and the official documentation to actually understand the inner workings of a web application or any other type of application.
Yeah.
And really, like you said earlier, Drew, appreciate when you do import a library what it is doing for
Mm-hmm.
you, right? You have that sense of perspective of what you're getting, when you import a library,
I think that's
or you're
something that
buying a
if
library.
you look back, some of the earlier developers that were sort of grew up on a much lower level stacks, you might say,
Well, they had no choice
right?
back then, right? We had fewer
Would you'd
libraries.
kind of take it for granted that if you're importing a library, you already have an understanding of how you would implement that library. Whereas I think today a lot of the newer people newer to development. They're so used to importing these libraries that they have this idea. They might not have much of an idea of how to create the library themselves, and so sort of instead of having these libraries as abstractions, we find it to be quite educational, at least,
Yeah.
and interesting as well, to look into what are the ideas behind it, how would we implement that, how would we get
Yeah.
started with that before just jumping into a library.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people that are learning things for the first time are really thankful for event modeling because it
Hmm.
takes away a lot of the what people think they have to understand technically to
Yeah.
say, hey, let's just organize the information because I know that this is supposed to be shown on the screen. This is what I think I need to store in the system. I can reason about it, and then my problems become small to just look on Stack Overflow or go over that tutorial again with whatever course that I took
Hmm.
and understand it at a level and solve that small problem. But when you're looking at it as a giant thing, hey, make a blog posting platform. It's like, where do I start? What's the first thing I write?
Yeah.
Is it irresponsible to write the screen first? Do I need to have something written first to have some sort of MVC thing? Because I heard of that.
Hmm.
People really
Adam,
don't know where to get going, right?
Yeah.
when people are first starting off, like one of the challenges they have is it's not clear how to break stuff up. I mean, like for me at least, like what I think of as senior is someone that a non-technical person can walk to and say, hey, can you make this? And they could do it by themselves. Like they might work with others to do it faster, but they could do it by themselves. But
Mm-hmm.
someone who hasn't reached that level yet, they usually need someone else to break it down. So I mean, like what you're describing is like it's not clear what to do, right? Like that's I think it's going to be the case for almost everyone who when they first start off.
Yeah.
Like probably
Yeah,
absolutely
absolutely.
everyone.
Well, sometimes it's not even just that it's not clear what to do. It's not even clear what could be done, right? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
as an example, I like to think of soccer, right? And you think about like here's a field, here's a couple of goal posts, here's like within this field is where you can play,
Yeah.
and so you might think like, oh well, you're going to start off by kicking a ball, right? Kicking a ball, or you kick the ball and you got to get it into those goal posts, and that's all fine and well as long as the person has the concept of what is a field, what are the lines around it, what are the goal posts, right? And what is kick. They might not even be
Yeah.
able to walk yet. So
Yeah.
you'd have to get to that point where you do those things. And, if people have zero familiarity with any of this, like what are the building blocks, the foundations to get up there? And I think that sometimes you'll have people who have some familiarity with software development, but they don't really have familiarity with systems design. And maybe they
Yeah.
should, but
Yeah.
maybe they don't. So where do you
Yeah.
start in that case? And
Well, it's really interesting because
Yeah.
the systems design, technical architecture, and all that,
yeah,
uh, information architecture is something that
yeah,
I think it was Jeff Doolittle from on our meetup is from Portland, a really cool guy that does a lot of DDD and CKRS and all that kind of stuff.
hmm,
But he said, I've come to the conclusion that this is a much better concept than everything we've been using. It is information architecture, and it really is an overarching thing that all the other things have to be subservient to. So if you
hmm,
get your information architecture right,
hmm,
the other places will find their homes more naturally. And not only that, but an information architecture speaks to a lot more roles. So it
Hmm.
becomes a lot more powerful. You're, again, back
Yeah.
to that silo problem in our industry,
Well,
right? And
I think it's really interesting to look at like information architecture or like information itself and think about even if you take the architecture away a little bit and you look at information, how information flows, it does flow whether we architect it or not. The systems that develop, often they develop because there's interaction among multiple entities, right? Whether that's information flowing, whether it's people interacting with it, other things interacting with it. And if you look at the way that sort of language, I think language is a very good way for us to look at how information flows, because we have language, we use it, and we communicate. If you look at the way that information flows between people, we have built-in very interesting things like redundancy. You'll have somebody say something and then explain what that is, basically saying the same thing again. So maybe they've said it, then they expand upon it, and then they repeat it, just like I did 3 times to explain redundancy right there. Right,
good.
and it's kind of built into our language, and we have things, and it persists over time. And I think that one of the things is, when we design a system, we might not be thinking necessarily that it already exists. There's definitely analogies to whatever system we're building that already exist, and there's real world use cases. And it's maybe like what you said a few times, Adam. I don't know the exact wording that you use now, but like you made it maybe the views, right? Like the way that people are seeing the information in your system, and then how that information is actually stored on disk.
That's right.
Very important, because those are the points that you can look at and say, well, that's how people are using this. This is where the information sort of what it's all about, what it's coming to, and how it's being used.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of neat because
Yeah.
it's just a way to follow the breadcrumbs of where things came from and
Hmm.
where things are going. If you have those breadcrumbs, you can think about things a lot more easily, right? And
Yeah.
I think the key thing for people that are getting into this and might have been, looking at agile practices and all that,
Hmm.
that small design up front has always been ignored
Hmm.
or used as a byproduct of some other activity.
Yeah.
The design is incredibly important. It's important for it to be small in terms of not taking a lot of time. So hopefully, event modeling gives that to most people so that they can at least reserve the spots, at least in their tables or other places, at least in their minds, so that they're not needlessly adding extra work later on, because that's what it's going to make. It's really going to put a sour taste in your mouth about the whole industry as to how you really the projects are never celebrations. It's kind of like these, oh, we made it,
Yeah.
good thing we didn't lose our jobs,
It.
it's out finally, and now we can sort of breathe a sigh of relief. That's a horrible way to end projects. So
Right.
we want the opposite. We want the easiest features and things to go extremely fast at the end,
Hmm.
and that cadence cannot be something that's elitist. It has to be
Yeah.
available for junior people as well, right? And I think how we do that is by just doing that small design up front, just
Hmm.
enough planning so that we know where things go and that everyone understands what the final goal looks like, right? And I think
Hmm.
a lot of times in today's industry, that is kind of done. Hey, we don't have time for that.
Hmm.
This needs to be just work in progress. Whatever else you have is somewhere in the backlog. Don't worry, we'll get to it.
Hmm.
But right now, I need you to focus to make sure that this thing's right, and that's very, very irresponsible. It's not the way we build houses. We don't build a two-story house by assuming it's a one-story house for the first month, and
Right.
then tear down the walls because we realize they're load-bearing walls,
Yeah.
and we need to build the second story. That's ridiculous, but that's what we're doing. And so I think if people realize that if we go ahead and do that small design up front, actually Agile is teaching that, except that the way that they propose a solution to that small design up front is really not responsible enough to get rid of that rework, which is painful and can jeopardize projects, and I don't
Hmm.
think is very responsible.
Hmm.
So minimize the rework by just agreeing on what it is that the final goal will be, but do it to a responsible level, saying that these are the places we need to reserve, at least for storage and other things. And that's not going to be a giant UML thing. That is not going to be a some sort of a monstrosity of you know uh, sequence diagrams, activity diagrams, entity diagrams, or object diagrams. 7 different seven dwarfs of UML or whatever, right?
Right. I like that. The seven dwarfs of UML coming out February 2021.
Yeah, I want credit.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Adam Dymitruk, it's been great having you on the show, and definitely an excellent talk. Hope to have you on again, and maybe we can dive more into it, and we'll definitely be checking out your meetup as well.
Yeah, I'll have a lot more of the code up for this Friday, so if people want to play around with that, there's a lot more of the slices are way more ahead of mine because I've been just doing the podcast or whatever, the meetup.
Yeah.
But the other people have been doing a lot more. So there's a really good PHP implementation, and there's a full .NET implementation there as well. And some people are trying their hand at Go. I'm doing the .NET Linux one. So hopefully this Friday we'll have some of those things working. Again, we're using Docker Compose. We don't have to, but we are, just to glue them all together, and some of it can be run at the same time, but you could just run them as separate processes on the same machine. If you manage to get Nginx installed on your laptop, that's fine.
Very cool.
That way.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, good to see you guys.
Yeah.
It's
So
been too long. So hopefully we'll see each other in person when this thing's over.
yeah.